Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. It is July 23rd, and today we're bringing you another seminar from the Myanmar Update 2021 conference that was held just last week in Canberra and online by the Myanmar Research Centre. Today's presentation is by Assistant Professor Elliott Prasse-Freeman of the National University in Singapore, and its title is Proleptic Uses of Failure in Myanmar's Anti-Coup Uprising. Following this talk, there are several questions which Elliott answers. Now, a quick note before I hand over to Dr. Nick Cheeseman, who convened Elliott's presentation. This talk relies heavily on images. It's about signs. So, although you are not getting the full experience of Elliott's research, the core ideas still shine through in this audio form only. And especially if you've been following online resistance to the coup since February 1, you'll probably be familiar with many of the images that Elliott actually refers to anyway. Now let me pass the torch on to Nick Cheeseman, who convened the panel that Elliott presented on.
So let me then begin by introducing our first speaker for the panel. The first speaker is Dr. Elliott Prasse-Freeman. He is an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. Elliott completed a PhD in anthropology at Yale, and he, in the course of doing the work for his PhD, spent many years doing extensive field work in Myanmar, concentrating on issues to do with political participation in life there in the 2010s and indeed in earlier decades as well. So he really is the ideal speaker to get discussion going for this session. I'd like to add on a personal note that Elliott and I met and got to know one another in Myanmar in happier days. And in fact, that we both had the same Myanmar language teacher. So Mingalava. Elliott, nice to see you again. And over to you for the opening paper in this panel.
Thanks, Nick. I don't know if I studied as hard as you did, so I don't want to put us on the same level with our language teachers, but thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to share some of my, well, I hesitate to call it field work because it's been all digital as I've been trying to make sense, as we all have, of what the coup means. And today I'm going to focus on some of the different anti-coup strategies that have been playing out on the streets, and as you see here below in this mass ornament of bodies in the paddy fields as well, as people are opposing the coup. And the title is UN Please Ignore Us, Proleptic Uses of Failure in Myanmar's Anti-Coup Uprising. At this point, the sort of activity of what's often called Gen Z has been much commented upon in the sort of ludic and transgressive protests that emerged, especially in the early days of the anti-coup uprising. We have an elderly woman rubbing her genitals on the face of men online, but then younger representation here in the middle, we have a femboy, so-called, with "shoot me with the cum, not with the gun," a woman in the bikini taunting the generals about the true source of military power, and so forth. But at the same time, not everyone was impressed with this. You saw a response also on Burmese social media by people who said, let's not get carried away. And I want to bring that up at the start because the Burmese protester and the Burmese people, obviously, given the coup, but even given the mass uprising of CDM, is not a unified actor. And so one of the challenges of making sense of what's going on is how to disaggregate all the different values and projects that are going on in the attempt to bring down the SAC, basically. Another split that we can observe is that some texts elaborate demands that partake in semiotic contexts and co-texts that seem highly local. So here we have images of Jainza Daipwe, which are something I've studied a lot in the past, this sort of elaborate esoteric cursing rituals, which kind of evade sort of secular realm domination and say, you might be able to do bad things to us like the coup, but you can't avoid sort of cosmic justice. And these things exploded across the country. The man on the right is in Mandalay, the ones on the left are in Bagan. Here we have others in Hledan and one in Patain, for instance, and here are the different kind of images that you can observe. And these things were potent enough that a call by this gentleman a Bedinse or a fortune teller for a people's chainsaw, Pitu chainsaw, Luchamu there, got him actually arrested, one of the first people to be arrested after folks started going to the streets. But other texts seem to take a different addressee entirely. So we have people writing on their bodies and mediating these these things that seem to take an addressee as a medic, but the fact that they're written in English, the fact that they're telling their mom they love them in English, seem like they're seeking a different addressee. The fact that they're not spelling English emergency correctly doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it perhaps means they're not just normally using English. This is a little bit more performative. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. It just, I'm trying to make sense of who is trying to be beckoned, who is trying to be called, who are these signs for. And then you see a lot of messages directly to the UN. Here's one in AFP about how we're dying. And then this gentleman who's saying basically, if a corpse is needed for R2P to enter, come kill me. We saw other signs that were explicitly addressing the sort of so-called international community to come save the country. And one of the most interesting and recurrent sign patterns that I've observed, whether through mass ornaments of bodies or through these signs that were written and then viewed from above, were these messages that seem to be to the so-called international community. And others folks observed it too and said, you guys are doing this wrong. The only way you can really get the US to come is to make it worth their while. A sort of parenthetical slide that is useful to trace for tracking how these things became really troped upon and became a part of the sort of conversation of what the anti-coup uprising was, is that there were sort of attempts by the regime to deface the defacements, and those failed, only rendering them more palpable. And these things were then gleefully circulated as they screwed up even writing out fuck the coup there. And that iconization of the phenomenon in forms like cartoons magnified their circulation, meta-pragmatically kind of called attention to them as a style and as a way of commenting on what was going on. Okay. Now, in this kind of early contrast I'm drawing, it would appear a significant contrast in demands as well. So the ones that were more local, although this one is in English, so the distinctions are not always so clear, says there is no supreme savior. This is outside of the Yangon Student Union. Whereas another set of signs were explicitly saying, please save us. And they're very different in their sort of affective registers, and they're very different in terms of their sort of appeals. Various appeals seem to work through different mediation technologies and seem to seek different addressees. And so in a tidy table here, it seems like one version were sort of internal. They were done in Myanmar. They kind of addressed other Burmese people or the SAC. The location of the address was a face-to-face encounter. You would see the Chainsaw Daipoi on the ground. And there was a sort of defiance in many of these appeals. There is no supreme savior as a sort of iconic one there. Now, on the other hand, there's these external ones that seem to mostly be made in English, although there are exceptions. Maybe the addressee is a sort of international community. What I find interesting semiotically is that there's a sort of God's eye view here. You can't read these signs if you're down on the ground. You actually need to read them from above. And there's a sort of entreaty, a sort of please save us. And this disjuncture is recognized and sort of turned into signs by Burmese themselves. So here, this classic strong dog, weak dog meme that Burmese folks use on Twitter and on Facebook. We have one version, me on Facebook, don't even worry about it. UN isn't coming. Don't waste your time thinking about that. But on Twitter, which is directed to an external addressee, oh, please give us R2P. Please come and help us. So at least this memer sees a sort of divide. And you kind of anticipated there was going to be and yet, because it has to be more complicated than that. Right, the sign, when made, is not a message that is even legible to those making it. I actually mentioned that a little bit earlier. It requires the reading of another subject to become legible, to find completion. And so it seems like it's an external addressee, but I only encountered these images. Most Burmese people only encountered these images on Burmese Facebook and in conversation with other Burmese people. So the external sign isn't really for the external audience at all. There's a sort of loop that's closed by Burmese people themselves. How does that change how we think about what's going on with these particular signs, and why does it matter? So I'm thinking of these kind of boomerang signs as involving mediation, right? Because they're mediated by cameras, and the sign forms they take, but not with particular mediators. And this contrasts with a lot of social movement theory, especially through Keck and Sikking's famous boomerang pattern theory that they developed in 1994, which actually really isn't a boomerang so much, or as a throwing stick. It's more of a relay. It actually requires someone to catch it, to do something with it, namely bring the cavalry and then throw it back. And it also contrasts with a lot of stuff in the literature about the sort of jouissance or pleasure that comes with even just being seen by the international, and requires the international to kind of see your claim and ratify it and ventriloquize, in the case of Rosalind Morris's essay. So what we see in Myanmar is that these signs don't need to reach their putative object, the international. They actually come back before reaching them. And so are the addressors, right, the activists split, or are activists playing both sides? And here's where I come to the thing which I think might be interesting about this boomerang thing I'm developing, is that dynamics within the Burmese anti-coup struggle compel us to ask, what happens if the global interlocutor ignores the appeal? Can the pleasure of imagining oneself being seen persist? What happens when the sign is flung, but it doesn't come back? And relatedly, on the power of the image, in the context of failure, to images that can try to interpolate. So when potent at the time of its first deployment, indexical of an agreed upon consensus about the injustice being endured, and a clear articulation of a collective demand to the world, does it recede into itself, no longer charged with any power to beckon and motivate? Worse still, does it become inflected by the trace of its own failure, a reminder of the way those in need were abandoned despite the image's demand? So you look at that image that says, please save us, and you remember the fact that they weren't saved at all. And instead of a powerful mobilization method, it actually becomes a reminder of failure. So here I want to relate to the topic or the title of my paper and talk about sort of proleptic uses of failure, which is what I'm observing in some of these activists who acknowledge the fact that things might and haven't in the past in Myanmar gone okay, but you can still use that to a certain extent. So Pace, Ernest Bloch, the kind of main theorist of hope, who always talks about not yet, that help might be forthcoming if we persist a little longer, push a bit harder, without giving up on that. What I think we can observe is that some Burmese activists attend also to the moment when not yet gives way to it may never be. We have been abandoned by the world. And they devise tactics that address simultaneously both potentialities, taking advantage to the extent possible within the constraints of the tension between the two. Continuing, so on one hand, to invest in by intensifying their original and interpretive tactics. So continuing to pile on more and more intense affect into their signs, and I'll talk about that in an example, even while anticipating their failure, acknowledging its possibility, and somewhat paradoxically making it a resource in staving off failure, or at least inflecting it to different ends. Okay, so specifically appeals to certain kinds of these weird addressees like the international community and also like the state, here the SAC, or the people who you were trying to mobilize. Their ability to interpret addresses and take decisions as collective actors is perpetually vexed. And that affords a unique addressee design structure that gives activists actually resource, an affordance that allows them to do stuff. So such that when a response from the international community, say, does not seem forthcoming, addressers can both persist in the hope that the message has not yet reached its target. So the inverse of that would be like the special rapporteur saying the generals will be held accountable, and Burmese people have to make sense of what that means. And yet there are other cases where they're saying, okay, so you said we're going to be held accountable. When is that actually going to be forthcoming? So while there can also declare that it has reached its target and been rejected, thereby blunting hope and making failure a resource. So a bunch of different actors here. And this is why I started with the idea that the Burmese refusing subject is not, totally coherent, but activists are able to say essentially, look, we're going to keep trying the international, but it's kind of a failure. So let's get on board these other sort of tactics. So on the side of the sort of not yet, perpetual persistence can be maintained as even apparent rejections can be questioned and displaced. For example, even if some members of the international community seem to recognize an appeal and reject it, are they the ultimate authorities? Is it not possible that those initial rejections were preliminary and the message still has not reached the true decision makers? So you can see how the hope of not yet can persist. But on the side of it may never be, by contrast, there's a proleptic acknowledgement of failure, allows movement actors to coordinate both tactics and effective investments, granting them the ability to declare, rather than wait for the international community, we must do this ourselves. So I want to show how this plays out in one particularly stunning example, and please ping me if I'm going over time because I get quite excited about this stuff and tend to digress. So there were these famous, now infamous propaganda photos released by the military to warn what will happen to activists if they too step out of line. And almost brilliantly, activists use their own brutalization therein as text. And one of these people wrote, "We will overturn the fear, no matter how much they torture us, we will never retreat." So by turning signs into their own bodies into signs of regime brutality, these things circulated, got picked up by places like Al Jazeera, and then got picked up by this really fascinating campaign called Sisters to Sisters, run by Dinza Shanlei, who's the person on the top there, which actually staged these brutalizations. And so what started with a couple of people who actually were brutalized pullulated into, I think, dozens of women at this point, essentially saying this is what's going on and redirecting some of the focus of the sort of anti-coup campaign to generalized patriarchy and sexual abuse in general. Sometimes, though, this relates to my theme of like piling on the affect, because you don't want to risk your image and its interpretive power being blunted. Sometimes it goes too far. One woman wrote, "You can only my vagina, but not my revolutionary spirit." And Dinza Shanlei said, "I try not to remember who she is because that's very risky for them." So she's basically saying sometimes it's gone a little bit too far. That's why I'm not including the image even here, but that shows the sort of desire to like try to break the camel's back by creating that sort of perfect viral image that will wake the international community from its stupor. Now, at the same time, some of these women then laminated on top another sign that directed this campaign to the UN. And so they're saying, "UN, please save us." We had this one on the right earlier. But then, and here's the sort of what I think is one of the most amazing parts of Burmese anti-coup campaign, run by a different Dinza. This is Dinza, who's a part of the NUG and I think a really amazing activist. She writes, "UN, please ignore us." And so while the meme was addressed to country folk, her message is only to country folk by way of the effaced addressee. So it is of that sort of boomerang. And it laminates both the appeal to the international and the international community's denial of their suffering in a single sign. So it proleptically anticipates rejection. So our first sentence identifies the harm, and the agent choose not to assist in rectifying it. So the UN, creating an identifiable addressee, but then anticipating that addressee's callous response, Dinza preempts it by saying, "Ignore us." She kind of effaces the UN as an addressee, kind of crossing it out, still there, but not really important. In so doing, redirecting the focus elsewhere to a different addressee, the Myanmar people. It says there are no supreme saviors, as the UN ignoring the Burmese struggle makes clear we must save ourselves. And in an earlier post, a couple of days earlier, she said, "We should try the UN, but we ultimately have to defend ourselves and our neighbors." So she sort of refused to relinquish the agency in the first place, foreclosing in advance the UN's rejection, boomeranging that sign back to her audience people inside the country. So hence, the boomerang integrates into the very same maneuver a double move of contradictory thrusts to both continue stoking the possibility of not yet and to stave off banalization, like the fact that signs will no longer signify. Activists reiterate their appeals by both innovating new campaigns and intensifying the effective content of extant ones. So signs with clever wordplay at the start that we saw give way to blood protests symbolizing massacred protesters or women staging their own sexual assault. Hip-hop dance arrangements come to integrate militarized rifle drills. Protesters use their own brutalized bodies as signs of resistance. At the same time, they use failure of appeals to impact the international to conduct local political work. So they either symbolically assault Myanmar's generals by what's worse than, arrogant general who believes they are the sovereign than to appeal to another sovereign to come attack him. Or they produce a sort of distance from the immediacy of struggle and violence on the streets as they inscribe on the coup itself summary statements about it. So save Myanmar, but also federal democracy, self-determination, etc. This latter sort of archive information project produces a field of joint attention in which Myanmar people talk to one another, foregrounding common enemies, of course, but also introducing dissonance that must be addressed. And the sign "We Want Democracy" posed on one hill is clarified and challenged by the demand for self-determination inscribed on another. What kind of democracy will this be? And I think this is an important place to close for a talk on failure, because as you know, when I was talking to this with Thinza Shanlayi, she said, and I asked about how she makes sense of the potential failure, she says the last 10 years have been a failure. They were a failure masquerading as a success. And I take that to mean if Myanmar gets back on a different track and does end up displacing the military, the larger question is how to avoid the failures of that sort of neoliberal authoritarianism of Aung San Suu Kyi's reign. Thanks.
Elliott's first question from the floor in Canberra was, this anti-coup movement relies a lot on social media and the internet more generally. How have the internet shutdowns since the 1st of February affected this movement? And can the movement even survive further internet shutdowns in the future?
So, as we know, there's been a lot of blockages of particular social media, and there's a sort of game of whack-a-mole as people switched platforms and then developed workarounds through VPNs. I've been pretty surprised at how durable Facebook has remained as a mode of communicating horizontally amongst members. And I think this is also sort of itself an emblem of refusal of the coup, to say, even though we know this is a banned space and we could get in trouble for it, we're still not going to cede this, CEDE rather than SEED, cede this as a space in which the junta can make its own version of history. And we see actually that play out in the ways that things that circulate on social media are, the SAC has to actually respond to them. So I'm thinking of the Shwedagon getting raided. They actually responded to the things circulating on social media that, oh no, we just borrowed it with, and we're going to pay it back with interest. I think I'm from the Jorot Therapy Then paper that just came out a couple of days ago on that, but there are other particular examples. And this speaks to this broader issue, which Nick has written about recently, about the sort of epistemological standing of what's actually going on in the coup. The fact that there is such a gaslighting, if you will, project by the military to say these deaths were, you just fell off your motorbike, we didn't shoot you in the head. Although there's this other really fascinating thing where they also are saying we're going to shoot you in the head. And I think that requires a lot more theorization. But in the midst of that project, people are essentially saying, we're willing to, the same way we're willing to get shot when we go in the street, we're willing to stay on social media to create a sort of archive in process, or archive in progress. But the deeper question, or the methodological question you hint at, is one of which we all know we're in our algorithmic enclaves and we get a certain slice of the truth. How am I kind of coming up with a more, I guess you would say, a good sample? And one of the things I've been doing is kind of going through the thousands and thousands of photos that are posted to local media. So like KitFit Media, for instance, has been very good at posting hundreds of pictures a day. And as a result, I'm kind of getting kind of triangulating, tracing how those things circulate to see how different signs get picked up. And so there's like theories of signs of circulation. So something like, the example I want to give here is one of the wives of the military leaders wanted to go after a social media influencer, and her WhatsApp audio got leaked to Mrat Chotu, who talked about it, which then got picked up by the Irrawaddy, which then looped back to the social media influencer, who in turn, her name is Pensilo, who in turn created a meme about it, of course, because that's what she does. And so you can see how this whole ecosystem formulates through how a sign transfers or moves through it. And so I think that kind of substantiates the social media space, at least to me, as a pretty darn important one, as a sort of uber space amongst all these other things that not only conveys things, but allows for horizontal communication in ways that wasn't possible in 1988. And I'm not like a big, wow, the internet is changing everything, but it is pretty impressive, the conversations that can occur.
The second question for Elliott was a thought about the use of English in the memes and signs of the anti-coup resistance movement. Could the use of English be a holdover from the old times under the one-party state, from the SLORC or the SPDC, when the military rulers of Myanmar barely had any command of English, and English was used by those inside and outside Myanmar to avoid the surveillance of these military regimes?
Yeah, so part of this I've been asking people about the English question, and I get a number of different answers. So the people behind Sisters to Sisters are pretty explicit. We use English when we want to talk to the international. We use Burmese when we want to talk to Burmese people. Other folks will say, actually, you know what? I don't even know why we use English. We just do, and that's sort of like the idea of language as sort of style, or also like sort of natural. It's how you kind of do things. So maybe we shouldn't put too much stock into it. The other thing is generation. Sometimes people are so young they didn't remember a time when the Tatmadaw, you needed to use English to circumvent the Tatmadaw. So I would say a lot of things going on with the use of English, and it's overdetermined, if you will, and we can't say just one single thing.
The next question again came from the floor in Canberra, and after commenting on similarities in Kashmir and Palestine, the questioner said, could you comment on how the internet creates a new global public, how these movements are reimagining international community beyond institutions?
So the international community, rather than being an addressee to whom you appeal, becomes a plateau or a site on which different kind of political claims are made horizontally back in Myanmar, hence the efficacy, or I think, of the boomerang. So I think instead of it just begging the international to save you, it becomes a sort of space in which things escape the sort of localized grasp of the Tatmadaw and its gaslighting attempts.
The final two questions are, one, how do you think that this revolutionary moment came about? How do you see it continuing? And two, many people are now being more sympathetic to the Rohingya. Is that performative, or does it belong to only a subset of people who resist the coup, for example, in Yangon? Elliott takes both these questions and replies with a combined answer before concluding.
So I think there's a way to address both parts of the questions by thinking about the sort of liminal nature of revolutionary moments, in which we sometimes assume that we go into these moments are already formed and then come out of them differently, and that would speak to the issue of like, were people actually upset? Well, they weren't until the coup. Well, maybe they were in deeper ways than they perhaps knew, and the coup reminded them and focalized some of that. In terms of the Rohingya, and maybe these are rough numbers, but I researched the issues there as well, and my interlocutors, half of them who are saying, F you guys, now you got to taste your own medicine. The other half are saying, now you guys know what we went through and we can get on board. But I think all of them are suspicious that this particular moment will actually solidify into anything else. The last point here is that the international community, I've seen tweets from Fortify Rights trying to coerce the NUG into getting behind the Rohingya is exactly the wrong thing to do, because then it's not an organic politics that emerges from people, but rather a coerced one, and it reinstalls that same sort of slavish relationship that the international community insists upon with most developing non-Western countries that it always does.